very warm welcome from the LedX family. In continuation with the patent law series regarding this thing, we'll be discussing the aspect of an brief introduction to intellectual property law. What do you mean by intellectual property law is very essential and crucial to understand the aspects of different intellectual property law and specific to patent law also, because it is the entire jurisprudence behind this. So it is very essential that we look today towards the meaning of intellectual property law and various components and what are the other regulatory bodies. So what we'll be doing is the brief overview for this video would be, firstly we'll be looking at just an introductory part as to intellectual property. Then we'll be looking to the meaning of property, because first of all we should very critically understand what do you mean by property. I know everyone knows in layman's language what do you mean by property, but technically and legally what do you mean by property, because it will be eventually be helping us to understand the meaning of IP. That is the third component of today's video. We'll be understanding the meaning of IP and we'll be understanding the nature of intellectual property. So what is the nature or what are the characteristics of intellectual property? After that, we'll be moving on to the aspect of the constitutional provisions or the constitutional provisions for intellectual property. Are there any constitutional protection given to intellectual property? We'll be looking into that aspect. After that, we'll be also looking at the jurisprudence of intellectual property, or what are the jurisprudential theories that support the intellectual property thought. It is very essential, though the jurisprudence might somewhat seem boring to people or to the audience at large, but jurisprudence always gives a base or backing to all the laws. Therefore, it is very essential to understand as to what is the jurisprudence or what are the theories that support intellectual property law. So it is very essential to know that. We'll be discussing that in brief, not in very much depth. So this is not a very critical aspect. After that, we'll be discussing the types of IP. What are the various types of IP? In just to give you a brief, there are the only two types of IPs currently. One is copyright law and another is industrial law. So in industrial law, various other components of patents, trademarks that are being covered, which we'll be discussing in depth while discussing that aspect. After that, we'll be discussing with the aspect as to why should we protect intellectual property law. We have discussed in depth in the brief. We have discussed in depth in the previous video. However, just a brief for all the IPs we'll be discussing in the video. After that, we'll be discussing what are the statutes and what are the IP regulations. So what different statutes and what different regulations govern the intellectual property law in India, as well we will see in some international scenarios also. Subsequently, after that, we will be seeing what are the regulatory bodies for intellectual property law. So what bodies do, which of the bodies control intellectual property law? So we'll be looking at both what are the Indian bodies and what are the international bodies that control or that kind of regulate intellectual property law. And we'll also be looking at a very crucial aspect. Now, as we have been talking much about intellectual property law, we have to see that what relation does it bear with technology, because intellectual property law somewhere or the other has a very deep connection with technology and with technological developments. So we have to understand as to what is the legal connection between intellectual property and technology. So we'll be discussing that in depth. And lastly, we'll be discussing as to the abuse of intellectual property law and what are the competition practices that are being developed in the intellectual property law. So this is a brief overview of this entire video, which we'll be discussing in this very particular segment. So with the very first aspect as to the introductory aspect for the intellectual property. So as we all know that intellectual property in layman's language is nothing but a property that has been developed by an human intellect. So it is very easy from this very critical definition to find out two components. The very first component being that there should be a human entity be involved, and secondly, there should be an intellect involved. So the product of this human intellect will classify as intellectual property. So in short, it is a man labor that he has involved through his mind and enhances into a product, and that product can classify as intellectual property. So this was just a layman's language or just a brief thing of what is the intellectual property. Even the Bombay High Court in Bayans Corporation's case went on to held that intellectual property is nothing but just a knowledge goods. So as we see that in normal terms, property is equated with goods or objects. That is why Bombay High Court went on to this equation and classify intellectual property as knowledge goods, because it is a creation of the human mind, and that creation of human mind has enhanced into a product, and that is why they have called it as a knowledge good. So we see that this was just a very brief as to what do you mean by intellectual property. Now moving on to the aspect, before we go on in depth and understand the proper legal meaning of intellectual property, first we have to understand that what do you mean by property. So as we see, intellectual property is derived from two words. The first word being intellect and the second word being property. So first of all, we'll try to understand as to what do you mean by property or what is the jurisprudence of property. It is very essential to know that. So we have to see that property is nothing but just an aggregation of legal rights that the law affords to you. So that property may be in any form. That property may be an object, that property may be a good, or any that sort of. To give a very legal definition to property, the Supreme Court in Jilubai Nanabai Kachar versus State of Gujarat, in that very particular case, the Supreme Court had stated that property extends to every species of valuable rights and interest, and more particularly ownership and exclusive right to a thing and right to dispose of that thing. So from this very small definition by the Supreme Court, we understand two things. That property involves an element of ownership, exclusive rights, and such exclusive rights are in a varied manner. Such, for example, that right can be that you can use that property, or that you can dispose of that property, or you have control over that property, or you have possession of that property. So we have to understand that property and ownership are very interlinking aspects to define property. So this property can be in any form. This property might be tangible, intangible, corporeal, incorporeal. So now a question arises as to what do you mean by tangible and intangible properties, because this is the basis for intellectual property. So tangible property means any property that can be physically felt or physically touched. For example, movables or immovables. Suppose, for example, this pencil, this is a movable property. This table, this is an immovable property because embedded in earth. So this all I can feel it from my senses. I can see it from my senses. This is why all things are considered as movables, immovables, and eventually classified as tangible properties or corporeal properties. The second aspect or the second type of property is intangible property. Now this is the very crucial element for our understanding. Now what do you mean by intangible properties is that any property that cannot be felt by our senses, or which we cannot, or there cannot be a physical presence of that thing. And these intangible properties are nothing but the creations of the human's intellect or human's labor. So this is what we qualify as immaterial properties or intangible properties. So this is the base for intellectual property, and this is where entire intellectual property concept lies, wherein they are classified as intangible properties which have all the aspects of property, that such property though cannot be felt but have all the rights, such as they have the right of ownership, they have the exclusive right to exclude others, they have the right to sell, they have the right to have symbolic possession. So these are all the aspects that are available for a tangible property are also available to an intangible property, And this intangible property of other various forms, intellectual property is one of the various forms of intangible properties, which is one of the characteristics of intellectual property itself, which we'll be looking in brief in a just in few minutes after we know the meaning of intellectual property. So now, as we know that what do you mean by property?